Hey everybody, Joel here, and this week we're going to tie up something relatively easy where I had a longer video last time. Twitching jigs have been kind of a new craze for salmon and steelhead fishermen, so I figured I'd do a simple twitching jig that could be used for either species. So in the vise here I have a 1/2 ounce Wonder Bread Jig, and the thread that we're going to be using today is Danville's 210 flat wax nylon in white. We're also going to be using Magnum Zonker strips in white, CrossCut Zonker in white, red Polar Chenille, and some red Iridescent Flash. Super simple. We'll get started right away. Let's get a nice thread base down. Trim off the tag end. We're going to take our Zonker strip. I just like to pull a little bit of the fur on the tie-in point. You don't have to. So basically, we have this upside down. So it's going to ride this side up when you fish it. So we want the fur to be on the hook point side. So where we need this to get tied in, probably going to just measure out, go right in the middle of the Zonker strip. Take your time, do it, poke it through. Take it out of the vise, just to get it up over. Line it back up in the vise. And then what we're going to do, we're going to flip this down. We're just going to put a couple of loose wraps around. Loosely wrap the Zonker to the shank. Make sure we got even distribution. And now we cinch it in. And if you want, you can super glue this if you want it to last a little bit longer. So basically here I like to go just a little bit longer than the whole jig size. So just gonna moisten the rabbit fur here to make it manageable. What we're gonna do is cut like a little arrowhead in the hide. If I can get in under there. There we go. So what that does, it gives us a little bit more natural flow. So another thing that I like to do here is this rabbit Zonker strip will fall a little bit. So in order to stiffen it up, we're going to take some super glue and we're going to moisten the Zonker strip. It'll recoil a bit, but when it does, make sure you pull it make sure you pull it, and then that way it maintains the right direction. It doesn't twist too much on you. It will twist just a little bit like it did here on me, but it will absolutely not affect, like it's not enough to affect the action of the tail here. So it's really cool. It'll actually harden up and maintain that. See how it's stiffened up here? It'll maintain a little bit of the integrity so it doesn't fall down. All right, next what we're going to do is we're going to take our chenille. We're going to tie in our chenille. And I like to use a little bit of red. Red is a good, well, also matches some of the dots into our pattern here on our jig. But red's a very good attractant. I'm just going to capture that. And then we're going to go about approximately halfway from where we tied the Zonker strip in to the head of the jig. Pull the fibers out. Make sure they're not, because this stuff is plastic, so it's gonna have a lot of static cling. So just make sure you take your time and get the fibers out. I always do a full turn on top of itself when we first start, and then I start doing touching advanced wraps, and we're going to be pulling the fibers rearward so that we have that sweeping buggy look to the fly. We're just going to capture this, trim the excess without trying to trim off any of the fibers. I always take my toothbrush, or if you have a dubbing brush, whatever you like, and I just try and brush everything out, and that way we have the full effect that we want. Okay, next we're going to take our flash. And this stuff's a little bit stiffer. You can use whatever you want for flash. And this stuff is quite stiff. You can see it's kind of curled up from being in the package. But I like it because it does give a really cool effect. So we're just going to line these up. Thumb it on the side of the shank. I just do 2 loose placement wraps. And then we can adjust the length and the positioning this flash has on the jig itself. And then we cinch it down. Next, we fold it up under. We do the same thing. A couple loose wraps. Check. You don't have to really worry about lining it up properly right now. But what we're going to do is gather everything up. This stuff is a little bit stiff just being out of the package. But we got to work with it. I really like it because it has a really cool flash to it. It's a bit stiffer, so you got to work with it. So I run it that it's just about back, just past the chenille. About halfway to the tail of the hide there. Now we're going to take our CrossCut. Do the same thing, pull a little bit of a fur off the hide here, and I also cut the hide on an angle so it's a decent tie-in point here. So this gets a little tricky. I always try and tinker with the best angle. Really have to get in there at the right angle. Make sure you don't trap any fibers down. I really want to make sure that we get this cinched in nice and tight. And then we're going to lift it up and then put a couple of wraps underneath and then advance our thread. And I'm just kind of building up the thread wraps here just so that it kind of evens things out and cleans it up. And then we're going to make sure that all the rabbit fur is pointing in the right direction. And we're going to start doing twists. So I always do a full turn and then advance. And then what we're going to do is when we advance it, we are going to do half touching turns. We're going to make sure that this is nice and snug. Making sure that we don't trap any of the previous fiber down. So right behind the jig head, I actually just do another complete turn. I'm keeping pressure on this. And where we're going to capture this, I'm going to try and wet my fingers. And this is where the 210 denier really comes in handy, because you can really bite down into this rabbit hide. The rabbit hide is nice and soft. So what we want to do is trim this off as close as possible. Flipped it over because the rabbit hide doesn't 100% line up when you advance tie it. So we just flip it over. We have lots of room here to clean up the where the hide goes in and where it meets the jig. So we want that to make sure that it flows rather nicely. Now, we can leave the jig here as is. And we can fish it just like this, which would make a pretty sweet jig. Or you could take anything to make another collar on this. So if you wanted to leave the rabbit back a little bit, you could actually tie in like a nice Schlappen collar. So if you want to put in more red in there, or if you want to put some blue accents in here, because there's blue in the jig as well. Blue is a popular steelhead and salmon color, so you can do that as well, and it lays rather nicely. You can put some blue Schlappen in. I think I have some, and then I can show you. So we can leave it just as is. Super simple. And I want to pick, the rabbit is not very deep on the CrossCut. So we want to pick an appropriate piece of Schlappen here. We don't want the fibers too long so it covers too much of the rabbit wrap. So, and it's not going to be a very long wrap here. Some guys will actually tie in marabou collars here. I find marabou, you're just going to cover up your previous work, because marabou fibers or feather fibers come off the quill. They're rather long. Even like your blood quill or any of the regular, even your woolly bugger stuff, it's still going to cover up all your nice rabbit fur here. So here what we're going to do is we take it by the point. We get the point here, and then we trim this off rather nicely to a little bit of a triangle. And that's going to be our tie-in point. So I try and be nice and clean here when we tie this in. And the reason being is we don't want any of the tip going up over the jig, because it's kind of sloppy. I mean, it doesn't matter. I'm sure the fish won't mind, but practicing good technique, making it nice and clean. Quill's twisted on this, so easy thing to do is just train the Schlappen a bit prior to wrapping. So I moisten and pull the fibers back and then wiggle my fingers, and that'll help with the feathers not coming out the other side. It's going to happen a bit. You're just going to have to manage it. See, nice and wasn't planning on putting a Schlappen collar in here, but see, I'm trying to make sure that we get all the feather fibers out. There we go. And this, even this thin Schlappen is going to be just a little long, but at least with a single Schlappen, and we're tying it rather sparse, it won't cover too much of our Zonker there. Now we're gonna just turn this when we're ready to cut it off. And just have a little bit of under wraps here. There we go. Making sure everything's all neat and tidy. You can use your thread wraps here to help with that. And we're just going to whip finish. It's a little tricky to whip finish, but once you do them enough, no big deal. Trim this off flush, and we're going to put some UV flow on here to solidify everything. So what I do with this stuff is I try and keep it off the feather collar. So I put a little bit above on the jig head and then roll it down over the thread. This also helps blend the thread wrap into the jig head too, give it a more natural taper. I mean, you don't have to do this, but it does help to keep the UV off the Schlappen collar here, or whatever collar you decide to go on. So I'm just going to solidify this. See how that blends perfectly into the jig head. And that's going to be rock hard there. We're just going to take our toothbrush and just lightly brush that collar out. And there we have it. Simple Wonder Bread twitching jig. It's got some flash, got some body. Got a really nice swimming tail. Great action on that Zonker. And this thing should last a really long time. As long as you tie it appropriately and get everything all neat and tidy. This thing should last a really long time, unless you beat it off too many rocks. But anyways, thanks very much, folks. Really appreciate the opportunity. Stay tuned for more. Cheers.